ahead and get started here. I see Richard walking in. Thank you for joining us, both watching this video and for coming here in person. Hi, Richard. Just marking you down.
Where are name tags here?
Over there.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. So we might as well go ahead and get started. I got a chance to read through these. Darby, thank you for putting the minutes together again. Did anyone have any comments for the minutes that were sent out from March 12th? No comments? Okay. And then I'd like to entertain a motion to pass these.
Second.
I entertain a motion. I can't technically.
So moved.
Okay, so moved. All those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, great. Okay. So just real quick, we're gonna add a little piece here. Jaya has requested to move her position from WSU faculty staff over to the Military Hill alternate position. If everyone's okay with that, I also entertain a motion to put that in place.
So move.
Okay.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Great, so we have moved her to the Military Hill alternate representative. Thank you, Jaya. All right, so we're gonna be talking, as a kind of a follow-up conversation for what we did last time we were here, we're gonna be talking about welfare checks. I know it's something that I've heard a lot about in the community, just general concerns of when is it okay to do a welfare check and when should you do a welfare check, and I think it's gonna be great for us to have that conversation today. Think about that a little bit more critically, and that way people in our communities can talk to us, and we can be good advocates for getting welfare checks when we think people may need them. So I'm passing that off to Sergeant Umbright. Chief, do you have anything to add to that?
Sure. I'll just add that Greg Umbright has worked for Pullman Police Department how many years now, Greg?
27.
And prior to that, he was with the Lake County Sheriff's Department and
7 years.
for 7. And Greg was recently promoted to sergeant.
Congratulations.
Yeah, congratulations.
So, Greg, it's all yours.
Okay. I think if this is where you'd like me to stand.
Yeah. So we record these and then they're posted on our YouTube channel, just so you know, and that's why we have the microphone and all that, so we can get sound.
Oh, gotcha. Okay.
So try and limit the cussing and swearing.
I did pretty good at that. So I've got some, actually, if you guys could take one of these and pass it down. Let me grab one for the Chief and Derby here, so you can see what's going on. And you guys probably never have anybody bring you anything, do you?
No, unfortunately not.
No?
Someone tried to
I don't know if I
tase
can
us.
accept temporary.
I'm not sure that's
Quite how it went down, but.
There you go.
There we go. There we go. I have a stance against tattoos.
Would you like a badge too?
Oh, yeah.
It might come in handy at home.
Yeah,
Are
I
these
think
the
so.
children's badges that we're giving her?
Junior officer badge.
Junior officer? Oh, my daughter needs one of these.
But
Can I make arrests with these?
at home, you bet.
Hand them out while you're making citizens.
Yeah.
Usually when I hand them out to the kids, I usually hand one to Mom too, just in case she has to
Really?
pull,
Oh.
so she can pull rank.
See, I've worn these before. For all of those who come and volunteer at the Lentil Festival, you guys get to wear one of the
Our
police
tattoos.
advisory tattoos or police tattoos.
With our polos, because you can't see them through your
Well, you can put it,
swaggy
you can
polos.
put it down here and put your polo on, and
Yeah.
so this is how you.
Or like forehead, maybe?
You could, and they're no free of charge during police advisory if you're volunteering.
Do you want a
right?
badge too?
Absolutely.
Excellent. Every parent should have a badge.
Why, thank you.
You're welcome. Are you a parent too?
No. Mm-mm.
Oh, well, never mind.
No, I'm to my students who get A's.
You bet. So now that we got the fun stuff over.
Now he's gonna tase us too.
No, I'm not.
He's gotta make that clear for the video.
There we go.
At least we can make it somewhat entertaining for the YouTube watchers.
No. Actually, if you try and do that, it doubles the fine.
Well, what the hell?
So the advantage is don't pass them out on a traffic stop.
So the
which one's the
advantages
get out of
are
jail free card?
non-existent, yeah.
What's that?
Gotta get out of
Get out.
I
here.
didn't have
That's
any
good.
of those with me today.
Okay, all right.
So I'm going to talk, and you guys have questions probably that I don't know that you have. So if somebody has a question, please ask, okay? I know that Police River Counseling and some other psychologists came and talked to you before about protective custody. And welfare checks are kind of wrapped into that, but not entirely, and I will show you why. So if you would pull out I gave you the large sheet there, and then if you have on the side with the two graphs, the total police calls and welfare checks, you can see, so the graph doesn't really show you a whole lot because we're in the, up in tens of thousands there. But I kept the numbers down below just so you could read the numbers. Over the years, our police calls have gone up a fair amount, from 8,700 to 1,363 last year, or 631. And if you look at the welfare checks in the orange there, they are actually still a small percentage of our total calls for service. Okay. But they have grown a lot. And if you look at the chart down below, you can see how they've been increasing over the years. So it's the same side. It's just the chart down below that says welfare checks expanded. And you can see over the years, they've increased more and more and more. The 2018, we've had 148 so far this year, I think, and no, 165 this year. And so I've just extrapolated that out to what it should be if it keeps going on the same level that it is. So let's talk real quick about what a welfare check is. It can be something from entirely minor to something, that turns out quite large. But it's generally anytime somebody's concerned about somebody or they're worried about them, we get a call and they categorize that as a welfare check. I think some of the increases in these have to do with cell phones and the uses of cell phones, because mom's on the west side, students over here, and then, they've had their phone, the battery's dead, or they broke it, and mom hasn't heard from them in 3 days, so we get a welfare check, right? And it's like, call your mom. Okay, I'll borrow my roommate's phone and call, right? But mom didn't have roommate's number. So I think that's been some of our increase in just the frequency which people talk to each other, okay? Sometimes the welfare checks end up in a serious situation. And if you flip this over, I want to talk for just a minute about protective custody. I know you guys talked about that last month and what that is, but protective custody, I don't know how much they differentiated between people with mental issues versus people who, for instance, are intoxicated and they need to be detoxed. Did they differentiate between those? Some? Okay, so when we have protective custody, police have the ability to take people into protective custody, as do the mental health, like Police River Counseling. And for instance, this form here is the form that Police River Counseling, we fill out when we take somebody to the hospital when the police do. And we have two sections on it. One is right here, they're incapacitated by alcohol, right? And then the other one down here, they're suffering from a mental disorder, all right? So when we have protective custody issues with somebody, it was really hard to glean the stats out of to pull the data out of our stats. But if you look on that protective custody versus suicidal, you can see in the blue that, and this is on this top chart on this page 2, okay? You can see that the blue is usually less than half of our protective custodies. And a lot of those, and then so the other half is detox and or just mental issues where they're not suicidal, okay? And we get a lot of calls for protective custody that don't start out as a protective custody. There are suspicious calls. They're disorderly calls, maybe a burglary call. I've seen it where it's a car prowl call. I actually made a list of these things where it might be a domestic violence assault call, and it ends up being a protective custody call. So there's a whole lot of calls that aren't welfare checks that we end up taking a person into protective custody because of the side issues, or the main issue, what's causing it, right, with the mental health issues. So having said that, we do take a lot of people into protective custody, and a lot of them aren't related to the welfare checks themselves. I ran a stat, and I wasn't able to get it on a chart here, but in the last 3 years, we've done roughly 1,535 welfare checks, where it's a welfare check call for service. And out of those 1,500, we've taken 58 people into protective custody. Okay. Now, that might not necessarily be because they're suicidal. It might be because they have a mental disorder of some other manifestation, even though they're not suicidal and they can't care for themselves, and we feel that they have to come in. Okay? So that's about 3.7%. On the bottom there, I didn't put it on a chart just because it really wouldn't show up, just like that very first chart where that small line at the bottom, you really can't see it much. Suicides completed in a Pullman jurisdiction, okay? So we had a couple years of 0. 2005, there was 2. One was actually a murder-suicide. And then in 2012, we had 4. In 13, we had 3. 14, we had 2. 15, it bumped up to 5. And I'm reading over the bottom page here and there. And then in 16, 1, 17 was 2, and then we've had 1 in 18 so far. Okay. For whatever reason, 15 was a bad year for them. Okay. Some of those might have been called in on a welfare check, and we found them that way. Okay. And I know that I've been to some of those myself, and some of that data is just hard to mine out of our reporting system.
When you say Pullman jurisdiction, does that include campus?
No, not WSU campus. So for instance, not the dorms. Yeah. But again, you guys know that we have a lot of off-student housing on the north end of College Hill, a lot of College Hill. So yeah, this is just Pullman data.
Yeah, Pullman
Okay.
Police jurisdiction.
Right.
Yeah.
Yep. So a lot of welfare checks, like in the last 3 years, we had those 1,535 welfare checks, and only 58 of them, people were taken into protective custody. But if you look at our data, we still had a lot more people taken into protective custody than those 58, because we had other calls that then ended up into a protective custody. And I wanted to kind of separate out the alcohol ones, because that's kind of a thing in itself, where we find people passed out, whether we see them or somebody calls in and says, hey, we have somebody that looks like they're passed out. Those usually don't get brought in as a welfare check, even though they really are. It would be like an intoxicated person is how that would actually get dated in our system. So those wouldn't show up very good. I think that Palouse River Counseling, or them, they probably talked last month about what happens on a protective custody. They get taken to the hospital, they get checked out, and that's whether it's a detox or a mental problem. And then the difference would be if it's just a detox, they get detoxed, and then a mental problem, they would end up getting evaluated by a mental health counselor, right? Let's see. Some of the things that I thought you just might be interested in of examples when I was, so some of these I had to actually read some of the report to see what was the data to pull that out and stuff on some of these. So I talked about the protective custodies where we had non-welfare check ones. And for instance, some of that would be a suspicious person or a disorderly person. We had one where they were vehicle prowling, and it turns out that they weren't. One was they reported that they were able to change minds and shift things, right? That was the report, that this person was doing this. Somebody was sitting naked in their driveway. Okay. Running in traffic, laying in traffic in the street, trying to kill themselves that way. Then we have a lot of just disorderly calls where somebody's acting out somehow, right? And somebody calls us because of they're causing problems, whether that's knocking over garbage cans, screaming, breaking windows, putting their head through windows, that sort of thing, throwing things, thrashing around, growling, right? One of them was lights were flashing them, telling them what to do. Okay. I know we've had one in the past where a person was driving up and down the street. Of course, we got called after they started crashing into things. And the reason they were driving up and down the street was it was cold that night and they were keeping the streets warm for us. Okay. One of them was a guy had 4 cougars chasing him. And he was sure about that when we got that call. A lot
Totally
of,
valid at WSU.
and then others are people chasing them too. Paranoia with other people. So the phone calls with welfare checks, sometimes we get them local where it's somebody saying, hey, I'm worried about this person because I haven't heard from them in a couple days. And personally, I'd like to see them go over and knock on the door and see their friend, but even though they're in Pullman and they have a vehicle, but we'll go over and do that. A lot of them are outside the city where they are, since we have a lot of people in town with relatives outside the city, a lot of them are from outside the city, and we go check on them and make sure they're okay. So that's kind of a down and dirty welfare checks and what they do. Yeah, please.
I do have a question for you, Sergeant.
Yeah.
So I just know that in other police departments, they have this practice, but in terms of a de-escalation practice, if you receive a welfare call for like a female individual, do you try to have a female officer present, or do you find that that doesn't really make a difference in terms of Pullman welfare checks?
Well, we have 3 female officers right now, so most likely one of them is not on a shift with the call. So we don't have that luxury.
Okay.
Okay.
That's just what I thought.
Yeah. But I would say when we do have one available, that would be something that we could do is would you rather talk to somebody and sometimes it helps, sometimes it makes things worse. Yeah.
Thanks, sir.
Yeah. What other questions?
Great.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I know the WSU Dean of Students office has, well, I guess I actually don't know how their process works. So they advertise that they have a welfare check-esque thing, but is that really just like farming out the welfare check process to either you guys if it's off campus or to WSU Police if it's on campus? Or does WSU have its own sort of system for handling those types of calls? Because they have like their Aware network and stuff like that.
Yeah, so for instance, I just went on one the other day that was initiated by the Aware Network.
Okay.
Yeah, it was an email sent out on the Aware Network because they're in Pullman jurisdiction, because they live there.
Got it.
I went and talked to them.
Got it.
Yeah. Yeah, I think a lot of those are handled, there's probably a lot of these that are handled like up on campus, behind the scenes.
Right.
Because somebody's worried about somebody and then they talk to somebody in their class or a professor, and then it gets handled that way without the police getting involved.
Okay.
Yeah, because they, you know, they have the network. And I think a lot of times people would call them on the phone and say, hey, you know, and then they do get a hold of them, right? It's usually when they've gone through those steps and then they haven't got a hold of them
Right,
that they call us. Yeah.
Is there a
Yeah.
limit on the number of welfare checks on a person?
Say that again?
Is there a limit on the number of welfare checks on a person?
Yeah, we start charging double after the third one. So, no, I'm teasing you. Yeah, no, there isn't. And we've, you know, it's kind of funny because you see some of these people in the reports over years of time, and where we've done a lot of welfare checks on them. Yeah, and we don't say no and don't go do it. Yeah.
Greg, can you talk about
Yeah.
forced entry and what circumstances would cause you to use forced entry?
Yeah, so, for instance, one of the reasons that we can enter into a place would be an exigent circumstance, okay? And we have to have that. We as the officer have to believe that we have that before we can force an entry. And, you know, a lot of times, well, not a lot of times, I think almost every time we try and get a key if we can, so we don't break things, right? And, but it depends on the situation, obviously. But if we feel that we have an exigency to get in there because of all the things are adding up, that it's not making sense of why, you know, like their car's there, they're not answering the phone, they should have been in class, or they should have been somewhere else, something like that. And, you know, a lot of those, well, obvious because, you know, we've only had 58 protective custodies out of a lot of trials, right? We get a hold of them another way, right? But, for instance, sometimes we do go inside and, yep, guess what? Nobody's there. And then we talk to somebody and it's like, oh, well, they're out visiting so-and-so, right? Even though by everything, it looked like they would be in their house, unresponsive for whatever reason, right? So that would be the times that we could go in. We would have to have an exigency. Another one would be a court order, right? So judges could say, yeah, you need to pick up and take this person into custody. And that would include entering into their residence. But a lot of times, like with the MHPs, they do a pick up and hold order, but it's not anything that we can say we can go in the house for if they don't invite us in. Most of the time, though, we had one just this last week, 2 weeks, where it was one of these games. We had a pick up and hold order, but they wouldn't come to the door. We got their mom involved. They shut the door in her face, right? That expired, the exigency in that wasn't exigent enough for us to go in, and the order expired with the MHP. Some other stuff happened. They wrote a new order. You know, we went and knocked, and it's like, hey, we got this order. It's like, oh, okay. It was completely different as far as that. Come on in, you know, and we took care of it and got him to the hospital so he could get the help he needed. Yeah. So good questions. I'm sure there's some more out there.
So what are some situations you think people should do a welfare check and they maybe don't? Give us maybe an example of a time maybe a welfare check could have helped in a situation.
Could have helped in a
Yeah.
situation? Well, it's hard to say on the suicidal people if they'd have given some sign that they were suicidal, or if somebody had thought about it and said, gosh, I wonder if they are, and then they should have called or could have called, right? And then we didn't. I do know a lot of people who are in that suicidal mindset are suicidal, but they probably really don't want to do it, so they make a call, right? Even though they've cut themselves, they're bleeding out or whatever it might be. And so I appreciate the fact that when they make that call, the people getting it do take it seriously, right? For instance, like on that one last week that I had with the alert system, right? You know, the statement was, no, I'm not suicidal, I was being sarcastic, right? And so that kind of washes that all out. But I would say that anytime a person gets that idea of, I wonder if they're going to be okay. Maybe that's the time to, if they can't reach out to them, to reach out to us to go make sure they're okay. Because we do have a lot of people that where we knock on the door and it's like, hey, so-and-so's concerned about you. They're glad to hear that somebody's concerned about them. And very few times, well, that's not true. Sometimes we have to take them into protective custody because they don't want to go. But a lot of times, we don't actually have to take them into protective custody. We just give them a ride to the hospital because they're willing to go, right? And they go there because they want to, because they know they need help.
So do they do anonymous checks as well? Or does the person have to report who they are?
No, for instance, like this one, is anonymous. The problem with anonymous, though, is if they're concerned enough about them, we usually have to have some dialogue to find out why. Because usually when it's a one-way conversation or one-way text or one-way email, we don't get enough information to do very much with it, right? And we might not have a good feeling about it, but we can only go so far because we don't have enough information to take it to the next level, like of exigency, right? And we've had that happen before, where we've done a welfare check on somebody and we haven't gone in because it wasn't to that level, and they were actually dead inside, right? Now, it wouldn't have changed that outcome other than we would have found out sooner.
Right.
But then later on, it did become exigent. We did go in and then found that, right? So would have made a difference. In the one I'm thinking of, it wouldn't have made a difference, but it could, right? But we also, we've had some of these suicides, and I've listed out the numbers here. And of course, I just skipped over because they were lower back in the 2000s, and I did go back into the 1990s. Where, I don't know if it would have made a difference, but I'm hoping so. If somebody could have said, hey, I think we need to check on this person or reach out to them. But that goes into knowing your friends, seeing a routine, or even maybe somebody that you're not a friend, but you see them on a regular basis, and it's like, oh, they're a little off today. What's going on? All right. Taking it upon yourself to step up and say something. Yeah.
How many welfare checks turn into criminal investigation?
I would say very, very, very few. Yeah.
And what does that usually cause, like violence, or do you find something on the property?
Well, I can't think of anything on a welfare check that actually has turned criminal. I'm sure they're out there, but no case actually came to mind when you asked that question. Usually it's more of the other calls for service that we do, like, the burglary, right? And we take the person into protective custody because they have no idea where they're at, and they just walked into somebody's house, or the car prowl, or they get in a fight with somebody but they really don't know what's going on. Or, we had one, we took them into protective custody. They had a fight with their boss, and their boss wasn't injured per se other than, pain. So we had an assault fourth that we were investigating, but then when we talked to the suspect, it's like, you know what, this isn't even an assault. The assault's going away because they're not in their right mind. You could never even show an assault occurred, right, by the elements because of their mindset. So we took them into protective custody and took them to the hospital. So I think more often we have criminal investigations that turn into the protective custody issue. Much, much more. Yeah.
Other questions?
Yeah, I'd like to state, I didn't even know it was a welfare check, but I've got a disabled son, our one child. And I didn't find this out till late, but a fellow had moved into his apartment and was using all my son's money to buy marijuana and stuff. My son was losing weight, and this came up, and finally we got my son, who was very intimidated, to call the Pullman Police, or we went down there, I forget.
Yeah.
And Officer Emerson went over there and got this guy out of there. And
Yeah.
that was really important. There's a lot of this goes on. It's just
So that
compliments to the Pullman cops, actually.
so that worked out really well for your son then.
It did, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
I kept wondering, why is he getting skinnier and skinnier? Well, he wasn't eating.
That's why. Yeah. So, see, you know, early on we had the very basic question: what is a welfare check? Okay. So let me go back to that. Do you guys have any questions about what a welfare check would be, or when somebody could do one?
Well, I didn't even realize what it was. We just called the police, you know, it's just,
Yeah. So to go back to that, it would be when somebody's concerned about somebody and they've utilized the resources that they feel they can before calling us and saying, here's why I'm concerned about them, you know, whatever it might be.
Do you recommend calling the emergency line or non-emergency line for welfare checks?
You know, it's not a big deal one way or the other. It's the same person that hits the button. Same place, yeah.
Pullman prompts.
Yeah, and I would say the non-emergency would probably be appropriate and save the 911 emergency lines for those if they're coming in, because you would tie one up. But I don't think it's a huge deal either way, yeah. You know, in some of these welfare checks, you know, we talk about protective custody, and some of it might be just the whole mental health care thing, right? We've had a welfare check where we found an elderly lady. She was laying on the kitchen floor for a couple days. Wow. And somebody said, I haven't seen her in a while. We think we need to check on her. And she needed help. Yeah. So, you know, being the good neighbor type thing, and knowing your neighbors, and stepping up when something's out of the ordinary and saying, hey, let's dig into this a little bit. That's a good thing. Yeah.
There was one example, I saw a woman when I was living on Pioneer Hill, kind of maybe in her 80s or 90s, kind of roaming the streets, and she wasn't usually roaming the streets, and I saw her pulling some door handles next door, and I said, that woman doesn't live there, but I called welfare check because I thought maybe she was lost or confused, and it turned out she was lost and confused and drove her car up a road she didn't know and thought she was living in that house. And it's just an example of just making sure that both her safety is secure and that nobody comes out with a gun thinking someone's breaking in their house, you know.
Yeah.
So just like when you see little things like that, or I think it's important for our community members to know it's okay to just call the police and have them come look it over. It doesn't mean that person's going to get a criminal record from it. It just means that you're going to help them out from a confusing situation.
And that's something to kind of dovetail on your question too. You know, that's one thing. Protective custody is not criminal, right? We're there to help, and some of it might be where you know what, you're at the wrong house, you don't know it, but let's get you home to where you need to be with somebody who's there who can take care of you. And I think that that's one of the things. You know, Pullman, we're always focused on the college, and we have that entity. But we do have senior adults who have dementia of some sort, and they wander down the road and they get lost and that sort of stuff. And I think that that's going to be more and more prevalent. You know, they say as you age, every decade you get older. After, 50, you have another 10% chance of having dementia. And as we all live longer and get older, we're going to have more of that potential. So.
I would like to sort of second what Richard said, but I've, in my career, had a number of instances where a welfare check was initiated and it was a suicidal person, and I have always had the greatest respect for how Pullman Police have handled those situations, whether it's been, you know, a really frightened college student or more recently, sort of a self-harming elderly person, both of whom may have reasons to be afraid of police, but it's been handled so well. It's been a wonderful job, and I just want to say that publicly.
Yeah, well, thank you. And you know, that's one of the things, you know, as an officer, that's one of the things I always try and keep in mind is, you know, how often do people call the police? It's not very often.
And when they do call, they really do need some help, and whether it's figuring something out or the welfare check like we're talking about tonight or whatever. And we, we try and get things, their help that they need, whatever that might be at the time. So,
Do you guys see a lot of welfare checks initiated by things on social media?
I would say some, but,
Not like, that
Well-
hasn't like increased drastically from,
well, I think it's more of if you want to include like texting as social media, sure. Yep, then I would think so. How many people put out there, I'm suicidal or feeling suicidal on their Facebook page? I think that happens, but not a whole lot. Yeah. So I couldn't give you a number.
Any other questions?
Well, by the way, this last meeting, when we had the panel here on suicide,
Yeah.
was really helpful, I thought. Very,
Yeah.
very enlightening.
Good, I'm glad. Yeah, I thought it was great too. And this is definitely a good follow-up, I think. I mean, the reason why I really thought it would be good for us to talk about this is I had a neighbor knock on my door saying, I'm not really sure if I should do a follow-up on this person, but this person, I haven't seen him in a few days, and I always see him at the mailbox at this time. And then I had a couple other questions. I'm like, no, it's okay. It's okay to call that in if you're concerned.
Absolutely.
Just go with your instincts and let our police officers do that service for you. And
Yeah.
especially if you're concerned and you don't want to go knocking yourself. So.
Yeah, and sometimes it turns out, well, a lot of times it turns out not to be anything. They took a trip that you didn't know about or something like that.
Yeah.
But there are times when it really is good that we're there because we can help them, and they really needed the help. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. We really appreciate your feedback and for defining. And how did you define this again? As
The welfare check
yeah,
part?
someone just being concerned about somebody. I like that definition. I think that's just a very simple, broad definition. It makes people more comfortable with using the welfare check process in general.
Yeah, and people need to realize you don't have to have I have to have this, and I have to have that, and I have to have that, right? A lot of times and that's why it's really good to not do it anonymous, but to do it with some feedback, because a lot of times somebody won't be able to articulate really why they feel that way, but when we talk to them, we'll ask them the questions, and it's like, oh yeah, I didn't key in on that, but that is one of the reasons why, right? And that's another reason why, and here's another reason why. And then we can build that of why we should be doing it, right? So we can help elicit that out. Well, thanks for having me tonight.
Yeah, thank you so much. We appreciate it. We appreciate your time. Over to Gary Jenkins for our police department. Thank you so much.
Thanks for the get out of jail free cards.
Yeah, what that means is you should know better.
Yeah. If you get pulled over, just put those in your flip
I've never been pulled over. I would probably pee my pants.
So here's an update on some staffing issues. You recall we were filling some records vacancies. So we hired Katie Nelson. She started April 2nd. She previously worked at Irwin Savage, Michael Buston Brown. And we are working on a background on our last person to fill a vacancy right now. So if that background is successful and we hire that person, then we will be up to full staffing in records once those people have completed the training in records. So we had 3 police officer vacancies. So we just recently hired a lateral police officer, Nathan Patterday. He is lateral from Oak Harbor Police Department. He did go to Washington State University, and he worked as a corrections officer for the Whitman County Jail for a while before working for Oak Harbor, and so he is going to start with us on May 14th. And so the real advantage to a lateral police officer is that we don't have to wait for the police academy, they don't have to go to the police academy, so he goes through our internal FTO program, which is about 3 or 4 months, and then he'll be out on his own. So then that leaves 2 other vacancies where I made conditional job offers to 2 people that are in background right now, so that just means that they have the final part of their background to complete. And once those are done, then we can submit their application to the police academy. And the next academy available is in August. So if everything works out right, then we'll be hiring them just a few weeks before that academy starts and sending them to the academy. And then they'll be out around December, I think, from the academy. March 14th, we co-hosted with Schweitzer Engineering and Department of Homeland Security an active shooter preparation workshop that we had people actually from all over the state and also from Idaho come. Nathan, were you there?
No, I didn't come to
Okay.
that, no.
But there were a lot of local people, but a lot of people from businesses and schools and law enforcement and fire. So it was a really good event. On March 21st, the Pullman Police Department did active shooter preparedness training for city employees on that day. And when we provided training, and then we had them go back to their workplaces, and then we simulated an actual an active shooter. And that went really well. And then we do active training for our officers regularly, and we were able to use the new Encounter Ministry building, which is now vacant and waiting for the city to develop plans for a new city hall. So we were able to use that building for active shooter training for our staff. So that was an excellent location to do that type of training, because there's lots of different rooms and that we can train our officers in how to clear rooms and respond to an active shooter. And so it was be close to like a school setup. Coming up on April 17th, I'll be taking a report to City Council to talk about parking and increasing our parking infraction fines. We haven't increased our downtown parking infraction fines for 23 years. So it's a time that we do that every 23 years, whether we need to or not. So, and then there's going to be a number of other parking proposals, and council isn't going to take action that night. They're just going to discuss all the items. We're going to issue a news release, I think, on Wednesday, and we'll have all the information posted on our website with the staff report and some of the proposals. And so if anyone wants to provide any input or feedback, you can either email us or you can go to the council meeting. I met with a professor at WSU, Marvin Marcello. He's a professor in journalism and media production, and he oversees their Cable 8 productions. And he's agreed to work with us on developing a recruitment video for the police department. So the upcoming school year, he's going to have a class that will work on that with us. So I think that's a win-win. It'll give his class some really relevant project to work on, and it would be really good for us. So that was a contact actually that Darby had from working at WSU. That's all I have. Oh, you know what, one more thing. Also at the council meeting on April 17th, both police and fire are going to discuss with the council staffing. And at least from the police perspective, we're looking at losing 5 officers over the next 2 years, just either relocating to another location or retiring. So considering that it takes us over a year, if we have to go through a recruitment process, it takes almost a year and a half. But if we already have a valid hiring list, it still takes us about a year to get an officer functional, working by himself out on the street. So I'll be making some proposals to the city council to try to address that. One includes hiring additional staff that we can already start the process of doing that so that we won't be so far behind when we start losing these employees. So that'll be part of the discussion with council, and hopefully we'll come to some, well, we'll get their feedback and their direction so that we can be ready for next year's budget. That's it.
Thank you so much, Chief Jenkins, for that. All right, so we're going to start with our poll now, so we can go ahead and get started and go around, and we'll start down at your end, and we'll see how things are going in our neighborhoods.
Hi, Bailey Bressler, serving at large. I live up on Collegeville currently. Just some things that I've noticed over the last month. Nothing major. We just a few dogs that were kind of out on the loose. I called animal control, but luckily the owners were able to come out before animal control showed up. Just some other things. Somebody did try to break into my apartment not too long ago. That was handled. The officers showed up very quickly. It took them just a few minutes, and the people had already left at that point. That's all I have over the last month.
Thanks, Bailey.
Richard Hume, Pioneer Hill. This isn't Pioneer Hill, but I subscribe to both the Daily News and the Lewis and Trib, and I forget which I read this in. But Mimosa, the mayor says he wouldn't go in there without a hazmat suit or whatever. What the hell are we doing? Why can't we get rid of that place?
There's no city code that allows them to, at least under their current conditions, to do anything without the property owner's permission.
Well, can we do something about that? It's an embarrassment. This is like
Well, I
a
know
third world country or something.
it's been a topic for a while. The city attorney's been involved in discussions about it, and I'm not aware of any strategy to be able to address that. But it's gone to a level higher than mine as far as trying to. I think everyone's well aware of how that's perceived in the community, and so there's been discussions about how to resolve that, and I don't know that they've come to a resolution yet.
As an old-time Pullman resident, I can remember when that was a first-class pizza place.
Pizza.
It ain't now.
Just on the topic of Mimosa, I was speaking with I was speaking with Dan Records, and he said that it might be complicated to tear the building down because of the river runs through there.
There was a Twitter discussion about it.
Right. that was kind of the.
There was like a Twitter brawl. It was great.
Yeah. So I don't know where they're at on that.
Yeah, go ahead.
Do I say my name and?
Yeah, you could just say your name and your representation, so, and then just let us know if there's anything that you've maybe noticed on Military Hill or talked to anybody, and if not, you're always welcome to pass.
My name is Jaya, and I am the alternate for the Military Hill. I do not have any updates today.
Okay.
Angelo Brown, multicultural, no updates.
Amy Newsbaum, Military Hill. Now that the cougar has gone back to wherever it came from, I think we're good.
Okay.
Bill Ullman, Pullman School District, thanks for all you do, no updates.
Nathan Dean, alternate to child in the Pullman School District. No updates. To have a comment and a question for you. Comment on the parking. I saw it was $10, and I was like, wow, yeah, that needs to be updated. So, especially if you get a ticket at WSU, $10 is a bargain. I think they start like $70 up there. So I support that that motion to increase your fees there. Just a kind of question for you. I noticed that the state legislature made permanent the current rules and regulations on public records and body cameras. Just wanted to see what your experience has been with that public records legislation and body cameras in general in Pullman.
Yeah, so essentially they removed the sunset clause and allowed the legislation that was passed a couple years ago to continue. And it was very helpful legislation. It dissuades people from submitting abusive public records requests, such as those that just are curious about something and they don't necessarily have a legitimate need to look at it, which imposes hours and hours of staff time, and puts the queue for people who have a legitimate need for records farther back. So it was really good legislation to have, and it's been beneficial to us. So we were really glad to see that happen.
Good to hear.
Does that mean that the people who really need it can get it faster? Is that what you're saying?
It does. That is
Okay.
the end result.
Yeah.
Yes, and it saves a lot of staff time.
Yeah.
For sure. Yeah.
Eric touched off business community. I don't really have anything to say, so.
Corey, with the business community, I just hope that a part of the parking discussions includes my universal permit.
I think he handed that out earlier.
Yeah, I'm
That's the sticker. You just put that in the back of your car, like the troopers have with the bears. You just gotta put it in your back windshield.
Barbara Hammond, College Hill, nothing.
Chris Santucci, WSU staff faculty. I do have a real quick thing to bring to this committee and chief, just to get your opinion. A number of the student veterans at WSU, very small minority, about 300 students with graduate and undergraduate, have been looking for a way to kind of get a little bit more recognition in the community and also help wherever we can. So they wanted me to kind of field y'all's opinions if you think it would be beneficial to aid in your active shooter training, particularly with, during the summer. I know they're reaching out to WSU Police in Whatcom County as well, or Whitman County as well, where during the summer we can run a training op like in the high school or the elementary school, various places around here. But we wanted to extend that offer that we would be willing to help out. As you know, veterans have kind of a different take on this kind of stuff, where it would also be able to, I think, would be beneficial to you and your officers. Again, it's just kind of like a reaching out and see what the sentiment is to help in that way. And so, yeah, just wanted to get your thoughts, Chief, and thoughts of this committee.
Yeah, well, I think what I would do is maybe get a contact from that group and put them in contact with our active shooter trainer and let them have a discussion and see what they come up with.
Great. Okay. What do y'all think? Any concerns from the committee, school district, if you think that would be beneficial?
I think anything that the police department might agree to, I appreciate your offer. I don't know how difficult it is to put together something like that, or to find personnel that would create a realistic situation and that sort of thing. But, certainly if we have something like that going on in conjunction with the police department, if the police department feels that it's a worthwhile partnership, then we support it.
I know that there's been talk on campus of doing, they have faculty and staff, active shooter trainings, but they don't have them for graduate student TAs that are leading the classrooms, and I think it would be important to reach out to that community and maybe put something together to give that opportunity for graduate student TAs to attend, because they are leading a classroom much the same way a faculty member is. So
As a graduate student TA, I second that.
Because I have qualifications to teach civilian active shooter training as well, so I'll bring it up to WSU.
Yeah, that would be great.
I think that would also be one that if we could put one together like for a meeting, that would be one that would probably garner public interest as well. I mean, I know we have a lot of people here today, but.
Okay, yeah, I'll write this stuff down, and Chief, I'll get the contact info for your FTO. And all right,
great. And let me just mention about the parking study. Angelo, actually, when you see this big spreadsheet, Angelo surveyed, it was 13 Washington agencies and 2 Idaho agencies, and got all of their fines that they currently have for a whole list of different violations. So it was a ton of work, and Angelo saved me a ton of time by doing that.
Oh, great.
Yay.
So you get a get out of jail free.
Or parking ticket, 30
Or
days.
parking.
I don't need one, I'm law abiding.
Show off.
We've got a humorous group here today. It must be because spring is coming and we're all getting a little bit excited
Took
about
my
that.
last prelim exam today, so I'm a little punch drunk.
awesome.
So, not real drunk.
All right. Yeah.
So I have a question. On, I think it was last Thursday, it struck me like there was a police car pulling people over in the downtown area that looked to me like it was Colfax police with a Colfax officer. It didn't say Pullman Police like the Pullman place is. And I could be wrong, but it didn't have the, well, it wasn't a normal Pullman police car. And so I just was curious about it because, I mean, I see the sheriff, I see state patrols, but it struck me a little weird that a car that looked like Colfax police would be pulling people over.
It's possible that a Colfax officer was in town for some reason and saw a violation and stopped someone, but if they're repeatedly stopping cars, that would be very unusual. I usually would hear about that if that was happening. But like you said, you know, Whitman County Sheriffs, they'll regularly stop people in town, and State Patrol as well.
Well, I'm used to those two agencies because they're sort of like, well, they have general jurisdiction, right, in the highways and whatever, you know. So, but I mean, I don't know. It just struck me as weird because I saw the same car pull over like 3 people in the course of like 2 hours or something because my shop down there, and I thought, what did they do here?
That would be very unusual. And did you see the words Colfax on the car?
Well, see, that's the problem. I didn't. It's like it says police. It has a symbol. Pullman Police always says Pullman on it, so I know it wasn't a Pullman car. It's more just it has the hubcaps. So Pullman Police usually has the black wheels with the center chrome. It has like the full hubcaps you might find on one, and then the officer looked like someone I've seen, you know, just driving through Colfax, running the Colfax stuff. So anyway, I don't know. It's just
Yeah, usually if that's happening, I hear about it pretty quickly.
Okay.
I'd like that followed up on. I'm very curious. That sounds strange to me. If they're pulling over 3 people or something.
And it wasn't. I know how the Pullman cars are numbered. Didn't have Pullman. I mean, so it clearly wasn't.
Was it a plain car?
No. When I say numbered, I mean you have numbers that define each car.
So what time was this? This was last Thursday, right?
Yeah, it was last Thursday, and it was just in the afternoon, like noonish to 3-ish, roughly.
This is on Grand Avenue?
Yeah, it was all between Davis Way and Whitman Street, basically. So just that little stretch there. Yeah.
Did you think 3 or 4 people were pulled
Well,
over?
I saw 3 people pull over, yeah. Yeah.
You remember what color the car was?
Well, it is the black and white car. It's the same paint. So it was a Ford Taurus, just like, you know, but it was the black and white. It said police on the side with
So it was a sedan, not an SUV?
That's correct.
Okay.
It said police, and it had the some sort of badge painted on the side next to the police, you know. Yeah.
We'll see what I can find out.
Yeah. So anyway, it's just was out of the norm for what I normally see around. So.
Do I hear anything else, or? All right. So, I guess I can entertain a motion to adjourn at that point.
Motion.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? All right.